Hey friends, if you wish you weren't hearing an ad right now, then straight after you listen to this episode, head over to curiositystream.com/notoverthinking. For less than $15 a year, you get access to thousands of high-quality documentaries on CuriosityStream, and you'll also get a special link to our podcast feed with all of the ads taken out. My name is Ali, I'm a doctor and YouTuber.
I'm Taimur, I'm a data scientist and writer.
And you're listening to Not Overthinking,
the weekly podcast where we think about happiness, creativity, and the human condition.
Hello, and welcome back to Not Overthinking. Taimur, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I had an unexpected poo just before we started recording this, so we're a little bit behind schedule, but that's absolutely fine. How are you?
I am very well, thank you. I was up till 4 o'clock in the morning last night reading Andre Agassi's autobiography.
Really?
Really, really, really good. It's incredible. It's so well written. It was ghostwritten by some Pulitzer Prize winning author guy that he talks about in the acknowledgements, but it was just absolutely riveting. I've been staying up way past my bedtime reading it for the last few nights. But here we are recording the podcast, and today is particularly exciting because we are joined by Joey Savoy. Joey, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks. Great to be here.
So before we launch into the stuff we're going to talk about in this podcast, we have a message from our sponsor. Taimur, do you want to take it away?
Sure. This week's episode is sponsored by none other than Skillshare. Skillshare is the best way to teach yourself anything online. They've got thousands of classes from productivity and making videos and music and all sorts of things. You have a bunch of classes on Skillshare, don't you?
I have a bunch of classes on Skillshare, yeah. So I think I've got 8 classes on Skillshare at the moment. 2 of them are themed around productivity. 2 of them are themed around how to study effectively if you're a student. There's one that's actually about how to be happier using lessons from Stoicism. And then there's one that I don't talk about because it's quite embarrassing, about how to cook, which is probably one of the worst things I've ever done in my life. And actually, just last night, I filmed another Skillshare class around productivity for creators. So that will be going up on the platform sometime this week, hopefully. So if you guys would like to check out hundreds of hours of my content, along with thousands of other classes where you can teach yourself absolutely anything. So if that sounds up your street, then head over to skillshare.com/notoverthinkingpod, and that will give you a free trial of the premium membership. After your trial expires, then the annual membership is less than $10 a month. That's skillshare.com/notoverthinkingpod, or hit the link in the video description. Whew, man, I'm sweating even doing that. Taimur, how was that?
That was great. Yeah, gotta put food on the table.
Exactly. Speaking of putting food on the table, Joey. So I wonder if we could start. Okay, can you give us like a sort of short bio of like what do you do for the people who might not have come across you before, please?
Yeah, sure. So I run Charity Entrepreneurship, basically a nonprofit that helps other nonprofits start off more impactfully and be particularly kind of great NGOs in various spaces. So it's almost like an education program or a training program, incubator, maybe a Y Combinator of NGOs, but very much focused on kind of the ones that do the most impact. So stuff that might be recommended by charity evaluators like GiveWell or that sort of thing. That's what we're going for.
Awesome. That's very cool. And I wonder if we could start by talking about your salary. So you famously decide your salary based on a spreadsheet. Like how does that work?
Yeah, so I take a pretty analytical approach. I guess in some ways I'm lucky where salary has never been like a really big focus of mine or a really big priority or this sort of thing. So we do something a bit different. Both me and my co-founder, we take salaries based on the kind of world average GDP, so kind of per person. So this is pretty low by kind of like London standards. You know, it's under minimum wage typically a lot of the time, and that sort of thing. But I think it's very interesting. So I find taking a low salary actually like quite freeing. So when you think about kind of the differential between the amount of money you need to spend to kind of be happy and then your skill and your like maybe potential earning potential, I think the bigger that gap is, the more general freedom you end up having. So yeah, it's pretty low, but I definitely don't feel poor or impoverished, this sort of thing. And I think it's very different than if you're in a dire financial situation versus, say, by choice, taking a really low salary so effectively that I can donate more or run our organization at a lower cost. That's why I'm doing it. It's for the kind of ethical reasons, although I've always been a little bit on the minimalist and frugality side, so that probably makes it a little bit easier.
Okay. So what's that number these days, and what are the kind of ethical reasons for doing this?
Yeah, so it's about 16,500 USD, that sort of ballpark. It moves around a little bit year to year and a little bit based on kind of what measures you're kind of looking at and taking into account. But yeah, it's lean. I think that it's possible for certain people who have like quite a familiarity with finances and how to spend and this sort of thing. And also, I'm a bit lucky. You know, I have no student debt. I have no kind of like reoccurring costs of children or these sort of things. I don't think it would be possible for a lot of people. But given my circumstance, you know, I live with a partner, that sort of thing. It ends up being quite achievable. I think if it's like someone looked around at my quality of life, they wouldn't be like, oh wow, you're clearly living like, you know, below London minimum wage or below UK minimum wage, or that sort of thing.
Well, so you never run into a situation where, I don't know, your friends want to go on holiday somewhere and you're like, oh, sorry, man, like this will break the bank. Does that not happen?
Yeah, not very often. So I can say that my friends are like often much higher income than I am. So sometimes they'll be like, hey, I want to go here. And I'll be like, yeah, that's not really in my budget. And they'll be like, oh, I'll pay for your ticket. So sometimes I do get to go to cool things on other people's dimes. So that works. In terms of trips and that sort of thing, I mean, I probably travel more than I would like to just for work. There's just a lot of kind of travel that needs to be done to change the world. So that's never been a challenging endeavor. But yeah, I think a lot of it, I mean, it comes down when you kind of like look at the super low levels of salary, it comes down to minimizing your reoccurring big costs, right? So how are you going to deal with rent? How are you going to deal with food? How are you going to deal with transportation? And I think I've got those all quite low. You know, a lot of the time it's like upfront investment in whatever a particular thing that's beneficial, or upfront making a really big spreadsheet about what's the cheapest grocery store to use, and then kind of refollowing those habits ongoingly.
On the grocery front, what are your go-to meals? Because I am like, this has been something I've been struggling with for the last several years, where I feel like there is too much choice when I go into a supermarket or when I'm on Amazon Fresh, and I get paralyzed by choice. And I think I need to just have a spreadsheet or a causal model of what food I'm going to be eating every day of the week, and then just have that on autopilot so I don't have to think about it. Do you do anything like that?
I do. Yeah, I think that's a really great idea. So interesting thing, you have to think about like what parameters you're trying to maximize for, right? So what do you want out of food? Do you want it to be easy to cook, really quick? Do you want it to be cheap? Do you want it to be healthy? Do you want it to be kind of tasty on a more subjective scale? And all of these are like somewhat sliders that trade off against each other. Like sometimes you find like a superfood. Like for me, peanut butter on bananas, that's just like awesome. It's super cheap, it's super easy, it's super healthy, it tastes quite good. That's kind of like a win up across a lot of categories. But typically you're making some sort of trade-offs between these categories. And one trade-off I make is variety. I don't eat like a ton of variety. I kind of have like a pretty regimented, similar sort of diet day to day, but I find it, again, it's kind of like freeing. Like I don't really love food. It's not a thing I think about a lot. It's something I prefer to just like, if I could plug into an IV drop when I go to sleep and then just like wake up and feel fully refreshed, that'd be great. I would like sign up for that in a heartbeat.
Okay. So what are your go-to recipes, or like how does it work? Do you have like a recurring weekly grocery order, or what's the setup like?
Yeah, exactly. So grocery delivery, I'm a big fan of. I don't know if you guys use grocery delivery, but everyone should. I guess everyone does now, but everyone should have been doing this for years. It's such a time saver. And even if you're living on really low salary, I think it's kind of worthwhile. So grocery delivery once a week, reoccurring order, set up some pretty similar staples. So I typically have like an oatmeal type breakfast, a fruit for breakfast, and then I only eat 2 meals a day. So maybe that makes it easier too, a little bit less logistics. Some whole wheat crackers, something like that, and then round off with some sort of vegan alternative meat and whole wheat buns and this sort of stuff. But a lot of it, so it's interesting because like I don't think my diet, like if you were taking pictures of it, would look that healthy, but every step has been like kind of optimized. So it's like, okay, what burger buns are you going to buy? Whole wheat versus not is a huge difference. What ketchup are you going to buy? There's 50% sodium reduced ketchup, 50% sugar reduced ketchup. There's actually 100% reduced, but that kind of tastes gross. So it's sometimes you have to make compromises there. But because I'm only eating, basically the same 7 things every day or every week, you can really, really get it down to a science. So buy 40 different brands of crackers and try out each one and look at the health stats for each one and determine like, okay, I'm pretty sure that in the UK, this is my favorite cracker. And just do that for everything. Again, kind of like upfront time investment for this like long-term reoccurring of, okay, now I'm kind of like, this is like a solved problem.
Have you always been into optimizing every part of your life? When did this start?
Yeah, it's gotten worse or better, depending on how you frame it. It's gotten more intense over time. I think I've always been very consequential, So I've always cared about the end line outcomes a lot more than the specific path to get there, kind of being like stubborn to the ends, flexible in the means. And I think even when I think back to like earliest memories, I seem to be much more consequential than other people intuitively. And my parents are both like pretty consequential. So probably some aspect there. But I think part of it was just I wanted to do too much stuff, and you can fit more into your life and you can do more if you optimize stuff. So as people know, an empty schedule, versus like a packed kind of schedule, you just get a lot more done if you kind of structure it and organize it. So I think it was like somewhat out of necessity that I ended up kind of optimizing on these dimensions. And once you optimize once and it works so well, you're like, I wonder if I could do this again. And maybe I'm more keen to creatively cross-apply to a whole bunch of different domains than the average person.
Have you read the book The Rosie Project by any chance?
I don't think so.
Oh, so I read this a few weeks ago. Apparently, it's one of Bill Gates' favorite books, and it's about this genetics professor who's got Asperger's syndrome, who is trying to find a wife. And I could really relate to a lot of aspects of it. But he does this sort of thing where he's sort of systemizing and optimizing every aspect of his life and his schedule, and it's done in such a, like, it makes so much sense. Every Tuesday he's going to have this exact same meal. He's going to go down to the market. He's got the preparation of the meal down like so quick, and he finds it's very relaxing to cook the lobsters in a certain way, and it's like a really super fancy meal, but it's just so kind of tuned to the letter. And as I was listening to it, I was like, okay, this actually sounds like a pretty solid setup to not have to worry about what you're eating every day.
I think people naturally trend towards this eventually, right? Like if you look at young people in general, they tend to be more in the explore mode, right? Trying to figure out a bunch of different things, trying to test out a bunch of different things. But then as people get older, they move more into like exploit mode, basically trying to take advantage of the things they've already learned. So young person will go to 10 different restaurants. The old person might go to the same restaurant every Sunday. But if you can just do that quicker, like if you can test more upfront and then put kind of your efforts to maximizing it.
Yeah, so on this note, like one sort of genre of comment that I often get, well, not often, but occasionally get on YouTube, Instagram, and things, is the thing of, hey, you're optimizing every aspect of your life. This is toxic productivity. You should be able to relax and take a break as well. Like, you're promoting bad things for mental health. And I feel like there are a lot of like strawman-y type assumptions baked into that, but I wonder, like, do you ever get that sort of sentiment from people that you speak to about this?
Yeah, well, I definitely get it. I mean, the boring meta answer is you can structure that in too, right? So if you think you need X amount of free time that's totally unstructured, cool, put that in your Google Calendar. Now, that's a very optimizer answer to an unoptimized question. But yeah, I don't think the evidence really bears this out. So I think people have this idea that like, oh yeah, if you're unplanned and kind of unstructured, you feel more free and you feel less stressed and this sort of thing. And then you actually look at data that has been taken on this, and it turns out that people who plan stuff, people who make kind of more conscientious choices or have a less kind of laissez-faire attitude actually end up maximizing their goals better, which includes personal happiness. So I don't know. It depends what your goals are. Maybe if you have like there's like an intrinsic value that like you want X amount of free time or that sort of thing, then fine. But I think people have maybe a romanticized notion of how good that actually works out in practice.
Yeah, why is it where does this narrative come from? Why is it considered weird to be systematic about sort of most of the parts of your life?
It's weird because it's not everywhere.
Yeah. So like, are there cultures in which that's actually sort of seen as a good thing? It's like, it's cool to have the Google spreadsheets.
Oh, I don't know if it's cool. Cool might be an extension across lots of cultures. Maybe very narrow cultures like my office or something like that. If you find it cool to do spreadsheets. But the weird thing for me is people are totally fine with being quantified when it comes to like buying a car or buying a house, like large consumer products. People are like, cool, let's do this analytically. But when it's like, oh, I want to pick a job, it's like, whoa, you can't be analytical about that. Or I want to, even determine what city to live in. Oh, that's crazy to make a spreadsheet on that. So it's weird. It's a very unequal application of rigor across different areas, and I'm not sure why that is.
It's interesting you mentioned the job and the city thing, because I don't know, maybe I just hang out with a certain crowd of people, but I think, optimizing job and city would definitely be seen as like a good thing and like a smart thing to do. I think that the realm where the sort of optimization approach doesn't really sit well to people, with people, is kind of in the sort of social realm of like making friends, relationships, stuff like that. People really don't like the idea of having a method to that side of your life.
Yeah, it's probably to do with some sort of uncomfortability with quantification of certain values in general, right? So it's kind of like okay to say like this house is better than this house on some sort of objective criteria. It's like less okay to say like this person is better than this person. But again, if you were to be analytical about social relations and this sort of thing, it wouldn't be necessarily saying X is objectively better than Y. It could be about a fit thing, right? So if you know that X character trait, like for instance, for me, when it comes to friends, partners, this sort of thing, like shared values is like really important. Surprise, because I really care about ethics. So knowing that about yourself is useful. It kind of like sets the stage for like a character trait that you care about and that sort of thing. I think people are quite uncomfortable with introspection. Maybe it's a bit uncomfortable to like realize the reality of what things you care about. So if someone's, thinking about like, oh yeah, here's the 3 things I wish I would care about, and then here's the 3 things I actually care about, maybe they're kind of like unflattering outcomes.
Yeah. I think there's also a bit of like romanticism around friendships and relationships and things like that, where it's meant to be this sort of almost like mystical thing that happens to you rather than that kind of stuff. Now, do you take the spreadsheet approach in your social life?
Yeah, definitely.
What does that look like?
I've used it in a bunch of contexts. Often story I have about like success of online dating. I did online dating as many analytical people do. Went on OkCupid as many analytical people do. It's kind of the analytical website. Spent a ton of time making spreadsheet for characteristics, looking through an outrageous number of profiles. I sent one message. It was like 4 pages long. Got a response from that person, was in a relationship with that person for 10 years. So like that's some sort of like success story for OkCupid that they should use in their marketing materials. But I don't actually think it was the website so much as the analytical approach. Know what you want. And at that point in my life, I had dated quite a few people, so I had a better sense of what sort of character traits were compatible and this sort of thing. For friends, I think a big part of it is you actually want to think about how these people are going to affect you, right? So there's the common adage that you are some of your 5 closest peers. If you think about that, you really want to think about, okay, like who do I want to be a sum of? Like, do I want to be 1/5 this person? And it becomes a much more like personal specific choice of like, do I like the way this person affects me? Do I like the kind of trends that this person's going to lead down? And I think, leaving it to chance or convenience or this sort of thing, it feels like leaving quite a bit of your life and your personality and your happiness on the table without thinking about it that hard. And I think people probably do get better over time at optimizing kind of accidentally, like they get experience of, oh yeah, I don't want a friend like this and that sort of thing. But it's very slow. It's very slow if you kind of do the blind feel approach.
Yeah, because you often hear people as they grow older, they say, one thing I've realized is that I can and should cut toxic people out of my life and things like that. It's a very like optimizing friendships is what they're getting at here. It's just a non-spreadsheety way of doing it to say that, this is a realization that I've had that person is toxic and therefore I don't want to hang out with them.
Yeah, I think the benefits of age in some ways is just like acquiring better heuristics, so better mental shortcuts that are going to lead you to better outcomes. But if you don't specify those and don't think about those, it's really hard to pass them on. It's really hard to kind of know what's going on. So I think people's processes like do get better, but in kind of like this soft, squishy way, they don't really know that like, oh yes, I have determined that people tend to influence people tend to affect my affect. So I want to be around like happy, optimistic people because then I tend to be more happy and optimistic. Thus, if someone's really negative all the time, I should probably not spend a lot of time with that person, especially if I'm in down states. Like people have that, but it's not explicit. It's not spelled out. It's more like this feeling of, I'm not as interested in that sort of connection anymore.
Yeah. So I'm very intrigued by your approach to the dating thing because the story in this book, The Rosie Project, is this guy who wants to find a wife, ends up creating a questionnaire, and he makes a questionnaire with like 100 different items, and sort of he figures out like, these are all the things that I want, these are all the traits I'm looking for in a partner, and therefore, I give this questionnaire to people, and it's, spoiler alert, but the person he ends up falling in love with is someone who would not have made the cut on the spreadsheet. And so part of the moral, if there is one, of the book is that there are some things in life that really shouldn't be quantified. But I think obviously the, spreadsheetization taken to the extreme is probably,
I mean, the moral could be you suck at spreadsheets.
Yeah. I think that's the right. I think that's the right takeaway. Yeah. I think when people approach this, they sort of view the spreadsheet approach always as like the most naive spreadsheet approach, where you don't account for like nuance and less tangible stuff.
Sure, you can never update it. You have to set it and leave it forever.
Yeah, and I think even when you hit, a lot of the criticisms about like effective altruism and things like that, which is like, the spreadsheet approach applied to sort of doing good in the world, the criticisms always assume like the most naive thing of like, oh, well, if you're taking the spreadsheet approach, there's no way, you must completely ignore anything that isn't quantifiable. And so that's why you're wrong, Well, you can bake that into the spreadsheet, man.
Yeah. I do think people, there's this book, How to Measure Anything, that I really like. And it talks about this huge range of issues that people are like, but you can't measure this. And then he just basically talks through, here's how you measure it. And everything in the world has some sort of output. So even if there's something like quite squishy, like, I don't know, having a good work culture, like what does a good work culture look like compared to a bad work culture? There are external signs. Like maybe a sign of a good work culture would be lower turnover. Is that the only sign? No. You probably want to look at like a collection of metrics, but there is an indicator in the real world. Otherwise, you wouldn't even notice it. When you're using these soft things, you're kind of gesturing towards this like fuzzy cluster of things. And many of those things can be pulled out and measured as proxies. And there you go.
So I've been running into this exact problem this week because last week I made a video called something like why I quit medicine and why I'm going back. And at some point, like sort of 25 minutes into this 35-minute long video, I said I addressed the question of do you not feel guilty that you're not working as a doctor in the middle of a pandemic? And I said, okay, let's think about this. I have a generally kind of utilitarian approach to this sort of stuff where I'm thinking, okay, what's my marginal impact as a doctor, as a junior doctor, 2 years fresh out of med school, where I'm no better or no worse than the average doctor, and I'm slotting into a system as effectively a cog in a machine. And let's look at my marginal impact making videos on the internet. And what I said was like, look, I know these are different things, but even if we use that, 80,000 hours did an analysis of the number of lives that a doctor can save in their career. It came out to 8 or 9. And I made the argument that like at the very least I could donate 30,000 to the Against Malaria Foundation by making money off of YouTube, and in in 30 seconds of being on the internet, I will have saved more lives than I would have saved as in my whole career as a doctor. And a lot of people said, oh wow, that's such an interesting way of looking at it. I hadn't thought of that. But there were people that said, oh my God, if this is how you think about medicine and being a doctor, then you shouldn't be a doctor because you can't possibly quantify the impact of being nice to the patient or, being that person who says something nice to them in their moment of need. It's like, yeah. So how would you go about thinking about that?
Yeah. So again, it's like, okay, there are differences in outcomes that you would expect from someone being nice versus not nice to a patient, right? Good example. There's a surgery close to my house. It has brilliant reviews all the time, and I know why, because it's really good. They're really nice. They're really quick. They're really efficient. They're really everything you would kind of want. But look, there's a number attached to that. They score 4.9 out of 5 on Google's reviews. There are ways to kind of get at this data. And will it be perfect? No. Will it be better than zero measurement and just kind of like hoping and guessing that something's there? Yes. So I think a lot of the time what people have trouble with is compared to what? They don't think in comparative terms. This happens with spending, it happens with jobs, it happens with all these sort of different things. So they're like, okay, this thing is, infinitely valuable or something like that. Like a human life is infinitely valuable. And it's like, okay, but if you actually thought a human life was infinitely valuable, you'd be doing all these like quite crazy things. You'd be living even cheaper than I am to kind of like throw money at charitable organizations, this sort of thing. There actually are values to this. It's just very uncomfortable to talk about and to think about explicitly. Like, oh yes, life is worth $1.5 million or whatever. People don't like that, but kind of the revealed preference is there is quantifications here. You could survey 50 people who have gone to 50 different doctors and see which ones kind of score at the top of a comfortability bedside manner and which ones score at the bottom. You could even put like a willingness to pay number on this and start to get some sort of quantification of like how valuable that really is. It'd be messy, it'd be crude, it would take a lot of time and resources, but you could. There are kind of methodologies to measure this sort of thing.
I think part of the reason, So I think these two things are related. So you mentioned the average. You're the average of the 5 people who you spend your time with, and I'm actually not a fan of that at all. I actually really don't like that approach. And then I think that's actually, I think because I don't like that approach, I can kind of understand where people are coming from when they criticize, for example, you, Ali, if you say something like, well, I can have more sort of lives saved impact by just making a YouTube video about my daily routine and then donating the ad money, well, whatever, right?
Yeah.
I think the issue is that it doesn't sit right with me. I think the friend thing doesn't sit right with me because it's taking a very sort of instrumental view of sort of your fellow human beings, where I'm in this friendship, and I don't know, but it's just a heuristic. You're not saying like this is the only criteria. You're not saying this is the only thing I care about. But it sounds very instrumental to say I'm in this friendship so that I can become a better, so I can become a better person. That's why I'm in this. I want to surround myself with you people because I want to be a better person or something. It seems very instrumental, and I think I personally don't think that's sort of a good way to view sort of other human beings as like instruments to achieve your ends. And I think partly that's why the hospital thing also doesn't sit right, because you can imagine that people would want a doctor who is who intrinsically cares about the individual in front of them and is sort of intrinsically motivated to kind of be nice to the individual in front of them, not extrinsically motivated to save the maximum number of lives in the abstract. And again, it's like, I feel like anything that sort of starts to approach taking an instrumental view of other human beings, that's what doesn't sit right with people. And I can empathize with that. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think it's a bit missing the concept. So a similar kind of analogy here is there's a famous utilitarian thing, which is say 5 patients get rushed in, they're all kind of missing a vital organ, and a perfectly healthy person walks in with a cough. Should the doctor, kill that perfectly healthy person, grab an organ from each of them and spread them around? Now, on the kind of very naive, quick calculation, you're like, oh, well, you're saving 5 lives and losing 1. Like, that's 4 in aggregate. Great, let's do that. But taking a step back, you're like, okay, that's like quite a bad society. That's not a place you want to live, where if you go into the hospital with a cough, you perhaps might be harvested for organs. And this has like quite serious ramifications. So I think if you were like to still end the point, you have to think, what heuristics do we want people to use? And maybe like using quantified heuristics when it comes to social engagements is like not good. Or using kind of calculations like this when considering doctor versus other career paths is not good. But it's tough because you already are using these heuristics anyways. They're just not stated, right? There are rules happening in your brain of who you want to spend time with and who you don't. You might not know them, the other person might not know them, but there is some sort of pattern to that. Like if we could like dissect you and kind of like pull out what's the actual kind of patterns going on here. So it's actually more about like a recognition of what drives you or what's causing a given relationship to work, rather than like specific prescriptions about what values you should have for the kind of person that you're spending time with or the people that you're spending time with.
Okay. I think that's a really good point. Yeah, I think, absolutely. A lot of what this stuff is just sort of making explicit what is otherwise very implicit. And I agree in instances where that's what's going on. I'm fully on board the sort of make it explicit, try and quantify it and so on. In the friends example, I'm going to try and push back against that a bit more. Do you think that's the way most people sort of approach friendships, of like implicitly gravitating towards people that they want to become like?
No. I mean,
Okay.
I think some people do. I think most people have a jumble of like 45 different things that they consider, and that fluctuates like the wind. And some days they really feel like hanging out with someone who's smart, and other days they really feel like hanging out with someone who's funny, and they have no predictive model and no idea which heuristic is taking over at which time. And it probably even changes based on the composition of the rest of their friends. So, I have 55 friends who are smart. I have 1 friend who's funny. I'm going to spend more time with that friend who's funny, whatever. So
Right.
I don't think that's the specific thing people are maximizing off of. I think it's maybe an underrated thing. Like, I think people underestimate the impact of your social relations on who you are as a person. So that'd kind of be something I wish people would weight heavier as a heuristic. But I don't think that's like the dominating one in most people's model.
Okay. Yeah, I also think like most people don't really approach it in that way, but I certainly, on like tech Twitter, there's certainly lots of people that kind of would go by the average of the 5 people you spend time with. And I mean, how strongly do you actually follow this?
Well, it's one of a few heuristics, right? So one thing, I think I have the general mentality that, if I think someone's going to like instill in me like quite actively bad habits in given things, like I find that quite uncomfortable, and thinking about like, oh, this person's, gonna do that. But I think that it's not the only driving factor, right? So there are other like characteristics and this sort of thing. And I think a lot of things that I have might correlate with this kind of like making me a better person. So like, say I really enjoy having high level conversations. This is like one of my favorite things to do with people. It's like talk about intellectual, philosophical optimization things. That tends to be people who are kind of good at that, kind of think about that a lot, kind of do that sort of thing. So maybe that's like a characteristic that I also end up valuing, and you end up talking to people about, things that are there. Another way to describe this is like common interest, right? So people with common interest with me tend to have interests in ways that I want to get better and improve and that sort of thing. So I would tend to prioritize, conversations with those sort of folks. But yeah, it's not like I have a spreadsheet and I have like 50 friends ranked kind of like top friend, second friend, whatever. It's more like I have this sense of what I would want my optimal friend group to look like or to be like, and then I kind of like try to move in that direction. Almost like you might have like an aspirational vision for yourself. You have an aspirational vision for like your social networks.
Mm. And is that based on? Well, I imagine that aspirational friendship group would be based on lots of different factors, like interest in ethics, interest in quantification, general how being around them makes me feel. Some of these people take care of their health, which more incentivizes me to take care of the health. Is that sort of the parameters that you're using?
Yeah, somewhat similar to that, although I would say maybe extra emphasis on areas that I'm weak at. So if there's something that I'm already like naturally very inclined towards, then I might not need like the social boost to do that. So like say I'm already a health nut, which I'm not. But if I was already a health nut, I probably wouldn't need that kind of like social encouragement from friends who are otherwise healthy. On the flip side, if I'm like health is the big struggle for me, that's like one of the things I really want to get better at, then having friends who care about health is like particularly useful. So there's maybe some sort of like competitive advantage factor of what sort of things you find difficult to do without some sort of social connection or that sort of thing.
Yeah, as we've been talking about this stuff, I've been thinking, I wonder how uncomfortable people would be hearing this conversation, because like for us, and like this is sort of the way that I naturally think anyway, just in a more sort of systematic approach to most things in life. But as Tame was pointing out, especially when it comes to the social sphere, things like dating and friendships and relationships and stuff, there's just something very, very uncomfortable that doesn't sit well with people about how can you possibly think like this?
Yeah. I think it is just uncomfortable things that you value. Like, say you valued something totally strange, like, I don't know, how good someone's hair was or something. Like, that would be quite like a repugnant thing to come to. Like, oh, actually, when I really think about it, at the end of the day, I mostly care about my friends because they have really good hair. So I think that's the scary part about like pulling out heuristics of kind of what's going on in that tangled soup that makes someone your friend or not. Like, the conclusions might be kind of uncomfortable.
And do you think that's why people are uncomfortable with this? Like, because they sort of in their heads, there is this thing of, oh, I worry that I will come to an uncomfortable conclusion about X, therefore I will not even think in that way?
Like, not explicitly. They're not thinking like, oh yeah, if I did quantify it, I'd probably come to this. They're more thinking that like any simple formula sounds like really bad and sounds kind of repugnant. And that's like probably true. Like if you pulled any three characteristics, like here are the three things that I care about when making friends, people will be like, oh, that's like a very simple bad model. But I more call this like bad spreadsheeting or like under thinking about it, as opposed to actually necessarily saying like we shouldn't have any quantification or shouldn't have any thought about what makes me connect with people.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like I often run into this so I'm a big fan about reading books about social interaction. And when I was in secondary school, I wasn't particularly good at talking to people, and I decided, hey, this is a skill. Social skills are a skill, and therefore I can find books and I can find like videos and stuff on how to do the thing, and I can put them into practice. And whenever I'd mention this to anyone but my close friends who were like actually also into this stuff. Like anytime I'd mention it to my mum, she would have a very like, social skills can't be learned from a book. And I would say, well, yes, I agree that they can't exclusively be learned from a book, but obviously, like when I say social skills can be learned from a book, it's like, it's like saying surgery can't be learned from a book. Well, yes, it can't, but like you want to read the book first to understand what's going on, and then you can practice it. But you don't want to just kind of go in blind and kind of try doing the operation without a set of guidelines. And I think I wonder if what's going on there is that when we think of this stuff, if we're not used to thinking in ways in this sort of where a spreadsheet can have like 100 different things, and our default mode of thinking is that a spreadsheet must only have one or two things, we automatically take any suggestion of quantification to the extreme and say, oh, well, obviously you can't learn social skills from a book, assuming it's just the book that you're learning social skills from.
Yeah, I do think this is true in general. I think that I mentioned as you get older, you like get more heuristics and get more tools. If you try to solve a problem using one tool, if all you have is a hammer, everything is a nail, and you just can't get very far, right? So despite me loving spreadsheets and thinking they're underutilized and this sort of thing, I do think that with the most complex decisions, you probably do want to come at it from like multiple methodologies, and that will give you a more robust conclusion. But I think that meta process can be structured. So say I'm making an important decision about a career. Do I think you should make a spreadsheet and like evaluate the top 10 things you care about and kind of put numbers on them? That seems like a useful exercise. It's going to give you a bunch of insight as to, this career might score higher than this. But do I also think it's worth, say, interviewing 3 people in each of those careers and asking them like a bunch of soft questions to get a better sense of narrative? Yes, like that seems like it brings a very useful additional perspective. And then what you want to look for is robustness of conclusions, right? So, okay, I looked at this from 5 different angles and they're all kind of like pointing in this direction. This looks like a better thing to do. So I think part of this is people imagining that you're only using one tool and then that being kind of like adding like an incomplete, resulting in an incomplete picture of the thing. And like, I have some sympathy to this. I do think that you can run into trouble if you use solely one tool. And I don't think this is true just of spreadsheets. Same is true of like talking to people or that sort of thing. Like if you talk to people, you're going to hear a lot about more conventional options. You're going to hear a lot less about unconventional options, right? Like that's a kind of natural flaw that will come up from using that methodology. So I don't know. I think it's like, have a fat toolbox, apply a bunch of tools to a given problem when you're encountering it. And maybe that's people's aversion to it, is that they're imagining it a bit more like exclusive than I think it actually ends up being. Yeah, and maybe if it's an unimportant problem, you only come at it with one approach. But
yeah, we kind of ran into this problem a few months ago. We did an episode where we touched on the topic of dating. And I recounted a story from a friend of mine who was telling me that the way I come across on the internet is too feminine, and I should have some more masculine energy by, for example, not wearing pastel pink t-shirts. And I sort of brought that up, and we had a lot of kind of emails about that episode saying, "Oh my God, how can you possibly boil down dating and preferences to the color of your t-shirt? This is just utterly absurd." And what we said in the following episode was that when we talk about a thing, in our heads, it's obvious that there are other things going on here, and this is just one thing that we're talking about. But I guess when it comes across in a podcast, if you're talking about a thing, some people assume that is the only thing that you care about. And there's just this like massive difference between this is one of a zillion different things versus this is the only thing I care about.
Yeah, and it is hard. I think naturally, if something's talked about 10 times, people will tend to weight it like 10 times more important than if something's talked about once. So if you dive into like a specific thing and you're like, okay, we're talking about this a whole bunch, then, in some ways there is like a natural implication that is like a more powerful thing. On the other hand, of course, if you constantly zoom out and talk about like, oh yes, any given topic we're talking about, of course, there's like 50 other things that are like kind of related and tangential and connected, then you'd never talk about anything specific ever, right? Like you can say, oh, having whiter teeth is like good for dating. Like, of course it is, but it's not it. Like you couldn't just be a giant white tooth and get a bunch of dates. Like it's it's kind of iterative factors and this sort of thing.
Yeah, I think in all of these discussions, it's really just a language problem where the language we use sounds very similar across a few different contexts, even though the things we're talking about are at completely different resolutions. So to say, hey Ali, if you want to be more successful with dating, you should wear more black t-shirts. That's a piece of advice, or that's a comment at a very different resolution to, hey Ali, the girl you're dating had a rough week, so you should like just be a bit more compassionate to her tomorrow or something. Like the language we're using is pretty much is structured in the same way. You're kind of giving advice about, Ali, you should do this. One of the things, the black t-shirt thing, is like a very high resolution, super general thing. You're not claiming that any single individual will truly be swayed by this. You're just claiming that in aggregate, there's probably some kind of effect there. Whereas the other thing is actually about a single individual. And I think a lot of the issues come from kind of conflating the two things, where someone's making like a very high resolution statement, and then if you interpret that as them actually making a very low resolution statement, then it's like, whoa, man, you're such a dick. Like, I'm an individual. I'm not swayed by your black t-shirts.
Yeah, I often wish that people would put like confidence intervals on their claims and this sort of thing. And this is, of course, the very analytical solution to communication type problems. But I do think people don't, it's hard to understand like what the strength of a given kind of thing that you're describing is, and also what your kind of like meta confidence in that thing is. So if I'm like, I don't know. Sure. Wearing a given shirt is like good. That's going to go well. How significant an effect size are we talking about? Are we saying that that's going to be like, that's going to like quadruple, results? Are we saying this sort of thing? And when you look at like clinical medicine and studies of charitable effects, it's quite specific, right? It's like, we think this will improve income by X%. And if you just talked about it in kind of like the vague way that people tend to communicate with kind of no confidence intervals, no description of like effect size, then it's easy to get a perception that the stated effect size is like a lot bigger than it actually is. That's basically what's going on. Is people are assuming like there's this massive effect size, and you're trying to communicate, it's not a massive effect size, but it is like a net positive effect, and in aggregate, these things can add up.
Yeah, sure. Just on this topic, we actually had an email from a listener a couple of days ago. I think she recently listened to, I think, the dating episode that you're talking about, Ali. I think in the email she mentions that her initial reaction to the t-shirt thing was like, this is ridiculous. There's that this isn't how people work, basically. But then she said that in her own sort of online dating profile previously, I think basically she found that something along the lines of she wasn't getting that many matches, but when she changed the clothes that she was wearing in her pictures, she started getting a hell of a lot more matches. And so, like, even though the idea and how it came across in the podcast was initially like weird and this is silly, like I'm an individual, people are individuals. It did actually make a difference. I think she's
this swings to an example of things people are uncomfortable admitting. Like, wouldn't it be horrible? Wouldn't it be a horrible world to live in that actually the color of your shirt like is a big predictor of whether people want to spend time with you in a romantic context? Like, that is not really the world we want to live in. We'd like to think that people are like a bit less superficial than that, a bit less easily fooled by a shirt color. But there is often this big gap between the world we'd like to live in and the world we actually do live in, and I think that causes a lot of uncomfort in different people. This is part of why I don't think people flesh out their values that much, because I think sometimes your values are like quite uncomfortable when you stare them in the face, as opposed to kind of like having them nebulously in the back of your mind, like, oh yeah, I kind of care about these 5 things, but if you actually like kind of gun to your head had to say which ones you cared about the most and the second most, it might not be that good. It might not be that happy a list to kind of look at. So I think the vagueness, keeps some romanticism, makes humans love to think that we're better than we are, and that we care about things that are more noble and this sort of thing. And I think that if you shine the harsh light of quantification on it, it can be bad. It can be uncomfortable. It can be not what you want. But my argument would be, if you look at your values and you're like, oh, this is the values, and I'm like very uncomfortable with that, maybe you should do something about that. Like, maybe you should work deeper on kind of figuring out, like, why is it that I care about this or care about that? It's hard to know how to change your actions if you don't understand the kind of like metacognition that's going on of why you're doing the things that you're doing.
What's your approach to figuring out values? Like, this is something that I've been sort of trying to research in depth, because I'm working on a book about meaningful productivity, and part of the equation is figuring out what direction that we're going to go in. And something people say is that if you figure out your values, then that gives you a pretty good first approximation for what are the things you value, therefore what are the things you should be doing with your life. And I've come across all these different ways of doing it, like value lists and stuff, but I'm curious, like, what's your approach to figuring, like, how would you actually define a value? Like, what the hell is a value? And how would you go about like finding what your own values are?
Yeah. These are good questions. So I'll start with the disclaimer of like, I don't think that they're like are objective values. I think they are kind of like nebulous, subjective things floating around in your head and this sort of thing. So there's not really right or wrong values. There are values that are like very different from other people's or this sort of thing. But yeah, for me, when I think about say a value versus like a preference, it's something that you kind of like want perpetuated. So if you say like I value chocolate ice cream, that would mean you like want other people to eat chocolate ice cream. You want more chocolate ice cream to exist in the world. If you say like I have a preference for chocolate ice cream, I might not care if you eat vanilla ice cream or whatever else. It's kind of there. So that's where some of the distinction goes. And then I think most of the time what people are talking about with values is they're talking about high level values, like these kind of like primary fundamental things. They're not talking about kind of like means values. So maybe I value being healthy on kind of a high level, and that means I should brush my teeth. But I don't value brushing my teeth. It is like a kind of a method to get that kind of higher level maximization of your value. Another thing that I think is very interesting that I'll touch on briefly is I think values change way more than people give them credit for. So I think people imagine that these are kind of these like very fixed elements that are kind of like core to them. But I think if you actually look at what it seems like people value in terms of kind of their actions and that sort of thing, it changes quite a lot over people's lives. It can be modified by experience and this sort of thing. So I think there may be like a bit less fixed pillar than people expect. That being said, there probably is some convergence. Like probably if you got 100 people in a room to think about their values a lot, they would probably come to certain conclusions more often than other conclusions. They might move higher up on that kind of spectrum, like more I value health, less I value brushing my teeth sort of outcomes.
Do your spreadsheets account for potential future value changes? Because presumably you're evaluating things based on your current set of values. And if there is some unknown future set of values which you might then shift towards, then maybe you should change what you're doing today, right?
Yeah, value drift. It's a huge concern. Current me really likes current me's values and does not want future me to have radically different values. Values are self-preserving. They care about themselves being there. So if I could take a pill and know that I would no longer care about people or altruism, interestingly, of course, I wouldn't care about having taken the pill after I take it. But right now, with my current values, I would say, no, I do not want that pill. And the pill doesn't have to be as dramatic as a pill. It could be anything, right? That's going to affect your values. So yeah, I definitely worry about value drift. If I was to say win the lottery and win $50 million, let's say, maybe right now, I would think, oh yeah, I want to donate the bulk of that. But I would probably set up a system to make sure that actually happens. So like maybe put it in a donor advised fund or donate it to a charity that then regrants or something like that. Because I don't really trust 10 years from now, Joey. That guy could be cool. He could be bad. Who knows? People change a lot more than they expect to. You always think you're at your final self, and you're really not. So if you are worried that your next final self won't be quite as, say, altruistic as your current self, then you do want to plan around that.
Well, how do you go about figuring out your values?
Oh boy. I mean, a lot of talking to people, a lot of introspection, a lot of that sort of thing. I think sometimes you know kind of things like nebulously floating around. For me, I spent a lot of time thinking about weightings of values, actually, because I kind of like knew that I had some of these like primary values, but it was much trickier thinking like, how much do I value A versus B? So I have a system what I call the 3H system. So these are like my top 3 fundamental values. And this is helpfulness, happiness, and health. And there's kind of an interesting story for each of them. Happiness and helpfulness are, I think, like quite self-evident. A lot of people have these values to some extent. They want to help other people be altruistic, and they want to kind of be intrinsically happy. But those can break down in all sorts of interesting ways. Like by happiness, do you mean life satisfaction happiness, or do you mean moment-to-moment hedonic happiness? Those are very different optimization paths. And when I think about, say, helpfulness versus happiness, how much do I value that? Do I actually fundamentally value health, or is health actually just a proxy to get at health and happiness again? So I think what I wanted to do is I wanted to kind of get this all down into like one page. I wanted to get down like what are my fundamental values and what are kind of like my sub values in those values, so that I can kind of like look over them and modify them. And it's a changing page. It's it's a Google Doc. I modify things and that sort of thing. But the higher level stuff sticks, and I have ratios. So for me, each value is one order of magnitude less important than the value before it. So helpfulness is like 90% of my time, energy, focus, etc. Happiness is like 9%, and health is like 0.9%. And then that other 0.1% is, pancakes or whatever else kind of doesn't fall into one of those modifiers.
Interesting. So when I do these kind of value exercises, one thing that often comes out for me is this, like I very highly value autonomy / freedom, which is played out in my life in sort of my biggest fear being shackled to a job that I might potentially not enjoy, for example. But then I think, well, how much do I actually value autonomy and freedom? And it's sort of, if integrity and honesty is on the list of values, but like intuitively I know that I really value autonomy and freedom, but like, would I don't know, be dishonest for the sake of autonomy and freedom? It's like probably not. But does that mean that I value honesty and integrity more than freedom? But maybe. But like that feels to not really sit right with me. Where if I think about what's the primary thing I'm always optimizing for, it's always autonomy and freedom. So any thoughts on that issue?
So there's probably like curves that matter. So if you look at like Maslow's hierarchy of needs or whatever, you have to like fulfill these survival values before moving up to the next thing. And I think there might be like minimum thresholds for some values that don't continue scaling up. So let's say my health value, only like 1% of my time and energy. But if I was like extremely unhealthy, like extremely sick or something like that, that value, of course, would get a lot higher. How it's kind of ranked in its context is based on how easy it is to kind of like maximize or satisfy or this sort of thing. Part of why health only gets like 1% of my energy is because I actually think it's like quite easy. I think it's a lot easier for me to be healthy than it is for me to be happy, for example. I think that's just like a much more challenging problem. So I think that kind of comes to it. So maybe the part of integrity that you value is actually like quite easily achieved. And yeah, if you kind of like create theoretical situations where you really have to like trade it off and you're kind of like below that threshold, then it's there. One interesting thing with values. Yeah. Sorry.
I was just saying, that's interesting. Haven't thought of it in that way before. Go on.
I think some people have maximization values for some things and satisfying values for other things. And that also can make it quite messy. So maybe for integrity, you don't need to like maximize. Like you don't want to be like the most integrity focused person ever. But you have this like minimum threshold. Like you want to be X level of integrity. And once that's satisfied, you're kind of like indifferent. My values, for instance, happiness and health are both satisfying goals. There is a level of both, which I'm just like, cool. I don't want to be the healthiest person in the world. I don't want to be the happiest person in the world. I kind of want to be an 8 out of 10 on both. And that's like good. Like once I pass that, good enough. Where helpfulness, so like saving other people's lives and doing altruism, that's a maximization goal. I don't really have a number of which I'd be like, yep, I'm happy with that. It's kind of like the infinite ambition that you have.
What's the point of writing these things down and ranking them and so on? I mean, it sounds like there's some fuzzy, nebulous internal process in your head, which consists of your values, and that's how you evaluate things. Once you've written it down, like what changes?
Well, one thing is you live by them more. So health, for example, got added because I figured that I would not prioritize it. It tends to be the thing that's forgotten. And as funny as it sounds, even putting it down as a 1% value has made me think like, oh, this is something I intrinsically care about. I do want to maximize longevity and this sort of thing. And I am healthier than I was before I had it as kind of a value in my mind or a designated thing. So I think that's one thing. I think your actions end up corresponding to your specified values. It also helps you kind of like break down, if you're kind of imagining it as like a tree with like your top level value, you can kind of break it down further. So in my 1-page document, I have like, for health, for example, I break that down to like 3 subcategories of like physical health, mental health, and habits. And then I have 3 like pillars of each of those that I think if I do well on, I'm probably going to success on that category. So for physical health, if I sleep 8+ high quality hours, if I eat food, not too much, mostly plants, and for exercise, if I use my feet to get to work and exercise 10 minutes of hard workout a day, that will probably maximize my kind of physical health goal. So you can kind of like break these down, and actually right below my values, I have like what my morning routine is or my day routine. And that is very closely corresponding to these kind of like ultimate values that I want. And it's very motivational to be able to go like, okay, yeah, I'm doing this 10-minute workout, not because I want to do a 10-minute workout today, but because it kind of fits into this overarching set of goals that I want to succeed on.
So then the values list, is it really more of an aspirational values list in that you then change your behavior to match that rather than these are my existing values,
I think it's most useful to start with your existing values, but then think about where you do want to put time and attention and focus on kind of like making certain values better. So again, I think they're more moldable than you think. So I think a lot of people, will think that like, I really care about hedonic happiness, don't care about life satisfaction. But then as they get older, they tend to care a lot more about life satisfaction and a lot less about hedonic happiness. And it's like, that's interesting. And I actually think you can do this deliberately too. Like you can be like, I want to value health. Like that's an example. I'm going to put it on my chart. I'm going to integrate it. And now I really do think it is an intrinsic value at about 1% weight. Like it really has kind of integrated with my mindset. Kind of like if you hear something said 10 times, if you hear that health is part of your values and you identify as I'm a person who cares about health, it kind of like gains a weight or prominence in your morals, your actions, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I've definitely found that as well. Like especially in the health example, where in the past I just sort of had this vague thing of, oh yeah, I guess I kind of want to be healthy. But then it was only like last year where I actually wrote down that health is something that I value probably above most other things. That without health there is no there's effectively no happiness, without good health, my happiness will likely be severely limited. Therefore, I should take care of my health more. I guess like before hearing you describe it as like maximizing versus satisficing, I just hadn't quite, because for example, a few months ago, I signed up with a personal trainer and I said, okay, I want to get 6-pack abs at some point this year. It's a fun goal to work towards. And then like every week he'd be like, how's your nutrition going? And I'd be like, well, I got a takeaway last night. He's like, okay. And have you been counting your calories? And it took a few months of this, a few weeks to months of this for me to realize that actually I don't care about getting 6-pack abs. I care about being healthy enough. And healthy enough is the current state where I'm at. And yes, I would like my biceps to be a little bit bigger because, dating. But beyond that, I actually don't care about the 6-pack abs. And that was enormously freeing. I was like, great. That means if I do the thing of eat food, mostly plants, not very much, and maybe, skip breakfast each day, #intermittent fasting, then it doesn't really matter if I get a takeaway every night, provided I fulfill, roughly these parameters of mostly going grilled meats rather than fried meats, blah, blah, blah. And now I feel like, damn, this is just so much more liberating, because I don't have to be counting calories because I've actively decided that this is not something I value.
That's actually a big thing that I think is another benefit of kind of like specifying it out. I think people have all these values, but they don't realize the trade-offs, right? So yes, I want 6-pack abs, but do I want to have 6-pack abs enough for the trade-offs in like tasty food? If the answer is no, let go of one of those goals. Otherwise, you're going to be constantly frustrated where you're kind of like, oh, I really wish I had the 6-pack abs, but I am not going to do it because I like this food. When you kind of like figure out, okay, how do my values conflicts? How do I resolve those conflicts? It is nice because you can just drop stuff. Like, would I like to be, like, I was a very fast runner as a kid. Would I like to be a super fast runner as an adult? Sure. Would I like to be a super fast runner enough to prioritize it above a million other things in my life? No. So there we go. It's gone. It's a goal that I would certainly love if I could snap my fingers and have it. But it's not a goal that I am willing to kind of trade off the time and energy that it would take to kind of make that happen.
How did you conclude that your 90% value is helpfulness?
Yeah, so I think I've always cared about people, and like many people have always cared about people. So there's like some kind of intrinsic drive there that most people have. And I think a lot of it was figuring out just like how extreme the level of suffering in the world was. So I think that when I was young, I imagined that the world was like my world, like the kind of most salient things. And there were problems in that world and, issues, education reform and this sort of thing, but they were quite small. And I think in that world where everyone's like an 8 out of 10 or something like this, happiness, I don't feel the same pull to kind of like helpfulness being this really important value. But when I found out that like, there's factory farming and the animals are in really bad conditions, or, there's extreme poverty and people are really, really having tough lives, or war, or this sort of thing, then it really changed. It kind of felt like, wow, this is quite important. I think maybe the most like fundamental value that I find very persuasive and very core is this like veil of ignorance argument. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this, but maybe for folks listening, in case they're not, the basic idea is you don't know who you're going to be. You could be born as anyone or anything. You're kind of like floating above the world behind this veil of ignorance. How would you want the world to look? And I found that very, very compelling. I found it very compelling when I first heard it. The more I thought about it, I was like, yeah, I just continue to think this is very compelling. And that's part of the kind of salary thing that we talked about at the beginning, right? So I have kind of done what I wish a lot of people would do, which is, kind of taken that veil of ignorance aspect and applied it. Of course, there's all sorts of caveats and that sort of thing. You get free healthcare in certain certain countries and how do you value that? So it's not like I actually think my life is on average with the average person, but at least I'm kind of symbolically gesturing towards that. Like I would like the world to be more fair and more happy, especially for those in kind of very extreme situations. So I think it's the extreme suffering that kind of like amped this up, and realizing that I could do so much about it too. So I think a lot of people have this perception that, yeah, it just takes like an incredible amount of time and energy to do this thing that's beneficial. Like you have to, become a doctor and dedicate your whole life to it to ever help somebody. But if I can, like, realistically save a life for $3,000, that is really, really a different bar than kind of changes my level of optimization and this sort of thing. So, yeah, I guess I feel like I can probably maintain, quite a high level of happiness, quite a high level of helpfulness, and then I have a bunch of like spare cycles, a bunch of spare energy, spare time, and this sort of thing. So kind of like put more and more of that into helpfulness. Helpfulness, I think, is like the trickiest goal for me because, of course, it is maximizing. It's not satisficing. So it's not really like if I save 1 million lives, I'm happy. I would just want to kind of save 2 million lives. But I think it's actually okay to have one maximizing goal. One maximizing goal can be really nice. It can kind of give you like the fuel and ambition to like continue to do things. Where you get into trouble is if you have like multiple maximizing goals, then you're in real trouble, because then you're trying to. It's very hard to independently maximize two factors.
I'm just going through like my sort of the way I've been living for these last few months and thinking like, what's the thing that I'm maximizing? I feel like, yeah, it's. I wonder if having like maximizing goals is part of why we get this hedonic treadmill in a way, where if you don't think about for example in personal finance type circles, they always say, think about how much money you actually want to be aiming towards, and then and like write this number down and like stick to it, because if you don't, then money by default ends up being a maximizing thing where you make $2 million a year and suddenly you're like, well, okay, well, I know someone who makes $10 million a year. Wouldn't that be nice? And the goalpost keeps on shifting. Whereas theoretically, if you've decided, okay, I can very comfortably live off X amount per year, therefore I don't need to now maximize money and all these in order to get more than X amount per year. Therefore, I can spend that time doing things that I actually do care about. Is that thought process, I would imagine, be quite liberating. I haven't gone through it myself.
Yeah, that's like along Stoicism lines and kind of getting to more of this, happy with what is. I think from a happiness perspective, weirdly, you probably don't want to set happiness as a maximizing goal, even if that was your top goal, because it's one of those weird things where, the more you focus on it, the more elusive it becomes. But other goals, if you do want to become like the best weightlifter ever, like you probably do need to set that as a maximizing goal and just like really go for it. So some goals aren't very susceptible to maximization frameworks.
I feel like folks like you and folks like Lucia and the EA community in general, maybe this is a mischaracterization, but it feels like if you're wired in a way where, for example, you and Lucia, for example, just really care about this helpfulness thing, right? Yeah. It's very simple to distill your values down into like, okay, I've got it's the helpfulness thing right at the top. That's like the main thing I care about. Yeah, a little bit of health, a little bit of happiness, but really it's about the helpfulness thing. I think most people's motivations, I mean, myself included, are just a much weirder mix of like, I want some social validation from my peers. I want to be, I want to so sort of broadly have fun day to day. Yeah, I want to be healthy. Yeah, it'd be nice to be helpful. Like, do you feel like I feel like EA folks have a particularly easy job here because you're sort of wired in a way where you really just care a lot about this one thing because, for example, you sort of hear the veil of ignorance thing and you're just really compelled by it. Whereas I hear the veil of ignorance thing and I'm like, yeah, I can see why you'd be compelled by it. Am I compelled by it? A tiny bit, Like most people have not found the one thing that they just find super compelling that they can just like build their entire lives around.
Yeah. So one thing is, I think you can, I think you can pick and build your life around this to some extent. Like I think there is, again, more flexibility than you would think. So, like, say I got knocked in the head and like altruism was gone or took the pill, whatever, and I'm like, okay, now I need some other kind of goal to maximize. I think I could be like, well, I kind of like this happiness thing, and I kind of think that life satisfaction is more important, and I think that a good way to life satisfy would be to like write a really good book. Okay, cool. I'm going to set that as my maximizing goal. I want to write a fantastic book. So I think you can use some deliberateness in this. I think a lot of people's values are you're looking a step down. So like social validation, right? Do you like intrinsically care about social validation? I'm not sure. I think probably that's like a need that needs to be satisfied to be happy. I think that's tied back to like some sort of level of personal happiness. So once you pull that, once you say like, okay, well, happiness is one of my fundamental goals, then what are the kind of like paths to optimize that? It might turn out that like social validation is like one of those paths, and like is pretty stable as one of those paths, and that probably is true. Like that's true for a lot of people that validation scores like quite high. But yeah, I do think you can pick a pillar. I do think you can pick almost if you have like values as revealed by kind of how I act right now, and then you have like values that I would like to have if I was like the person controlling the sim of myself walking around the little world. I think you can like push your values a little bit closer to that. You probably can't like change them massively. Like if you really care about A, and then you're like, I actually from a kind of like philosophical perspective shouldn't care about A. That's quite tough. But I do think that you can like kind of move them in your more aspirational direction.
What's the menu of options here? Because, for example, you said social validation is a subset of happiness. What do you have we got like a list of top level values that where we can sort of just be like, okay, yeah, I'll go for that one, or is that too simplistic a way of looking at it?
Yeah, it's a bit tricky. So I think there are many people who say, oh, it all boils down to happiness. Like even my altruism drive, it's just that like I would not be able to be happy with myself unless I was X level of altruistic. But then I think that's like kind of useless as a framework, right? Because you're like, okay, cool, everything boils down to happiness. Now what the heck are we even talking about when we talk to values? So I think it's more something that you think is like fundamental and not a means to an end. So, for example, I have friends who are like very libertarian, and they would choose freedom over happiness. There would be like worlds where they would be more free but less happy, and they'd be like, yes, I would pick that. That to me feels like freedom starts to be a more fundamental value there, as opposed to a maximization to kind of happiness. Where if someone was like, yeah, I care about this, but mainly why I care about this is because it would like make me feel good and make me feel happy and this sort of thing, then it feels a bit more like a means to an end. So I think if you try to like pull that out, like, would I still care about this if I knew for a fact it would not, maximize these other values that I have? So maximize happiness, for example, then I think it starts to move into the more like fundamental value category. And there are probably like some things that are more common up here and things that are less common. Fairness is one that a lot of people have, for example, like they have a really strong fairness drive, kind of outside of individual happiness and this sort of thing. That's a common one. The ones described in Righteous Mind and that sort of thing, I think those pillars can quite often be independent. Someone is like willing to be pure, independent of how it affects their happiness and this sort of thing. Yeah, I'd be curious, when you think about, because you guys are both productivity orientated, when you think about kind of, I want to become better at A, where does it stop? Like, where does it tend to dead end in terms of like, oh yeah, okay, like this has met the end. How high up do you think you go towards something like a fundamental value?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. I feel like in general, I just don't really care about maximizing. I can't think of anything I care about maximizing. I'm just very like, get
to the satisfied point
oriented with everything. Yeah,
that's probably good from a happiness perspective. Like maximization. Like I think ambition is very useful, but it's also probably like quite bad for happiness in most situations.
Yeah, it was Esther Perel or something. Some sort of relationship coach type person was on some podcast recently, and she was kind of talking about this, where with a lot of her clients are sort of, very analytical type people. Maybe they work in tech and things like that, and a lot of them take a very sometimes issues come from taking a very maximizing approach to your relationship, where you've been with a partner for a few years, and the mind starts to wonder of like, oh, maybe I could find a better partner who's the same but a bit more attractive, or like the same but a bit more nice, or whatever. And it's taking the maximizing approach to relationships in that sense, at least in her experience, leads to more problems. And it's the people who have a very satisfying approach to their relationship who are actually much happier. I think
I'm very sympathetic to that.
Yeah,
that sounds like the happiness one.
Yeah, I think I'm totally on. Yeah, I think satisfying is definitely how I approach sort of the sort of social realm.
Yeah, I think certain goals, even if your goal is maximizing, weirdly, it's better to have satisfying values, like happiness, and most social things I think are like this too, because there's negative flow through effects of kind of like constantly being analytical about stuff. And it's also just processing power. So one critique that I hear about, being very analytical all the time is like, oh, don't you get like tired? And like, isn't that a lot of analytical thought? And you kind of like are done with it. And there is to some extent this, like maybe I find it like personally fun to make a spreadsheet. So like, okay, cool. It doesn't tire me. But if you have only so many analytical hours in a given day, I think you do want to think about which problems are going to benefit from those analytical hours the most. And like some problems are very good that you can make really good analytical progress on them quickly, and other problems are completely intractable.
Yeah.
Yeah, on the maximizing satisficing thing, I've been thinking about like my own personal goals, and I don't really like to think of goals because I feel I have an aversion to the word goal. But that aside, with my own personal goals, I feel like they're mostly satisficing. But for example, like I am writing this book at the moment, and I know I want this book to be as good as as good as I can possibly make it. Now that feels like a satisficing goal in that I want to be satisfied with the book I've written, but it also has an element of being a maximizing goal in that I want to make it's on the road to maximization that I will end up along this thing of okay, I'm now satisfied with this book. Equally, one sort of goal that's been in my mind with this book, which will come out like three years from now, so it's like very kind of medium-term plan, is I would love for this to hit the New York Times bestseller list. Just kind of, it's so arbitrary and so stupid, and every time I think about it, it actively makes me less happy and enjoy the journey of writing the book less, because now that there's this baggage associated with it. But at the same time, I kind of think, oh, this would be kind of nice. Like, I guess, I don't know, an actor might be thinking, oh, I guess it would be kind of nice to win an Oscar for this performance. Like, how does that work within our framework of like maximizing versus satisficing? Or
yeah, well, I feel like the question becomes, what's the useful frame for you? So if someone's like motivated by, oh yeah, I want to hit the New York sellers list, and like that like gets them up in the morning and like gets them to type a whole bunch and that sort of thing, I think like, cool, great, put the New York best times list like on your mirror and use that as fuel. On the other hand, if it's an anchor, if it's slowing you down, then I think it's like not a very valuable kind of like sub goal or a stated thing to get there. So I think, creative work is really, really messy with this. So I write quite a bit too, boring nonfiction about how to start a charity that I try to make entertaining. But I have found that there's like huge variation day to day in like how good writing quality is. And a lot of writers describe this, that like, yeah, one day it's just flowing and the next day it's just like garbage. And you want to set up goals that make you have more of those like excellent days. And sometimes that's, goals that are a little bit ambitious, and other times that's like, no, I'm just going to like write when it really sparks my fancy, and that's how I like output the best thing. So to put analysis on whether to have analysis or not, if you were to like track your days and like think like, how good a writing day is this? And then think about like, okay, I thought about this goal for like a week while writing. I didn't think about this goal for a week while writing. And then you saw what the output is. That seems to be like the most valuable strategy for that. So if you know something is like not a useful thought, like trash it, like try to get rid of that desire, or at least put it in the back of the mind so it's not salient.
Yeah, that seems very helpful. Like even though I haven't explicitly tracked this, implicitly I know that whenever I think of kind of the marketing of the book, I think, oh God. Whenever I think of the writing of a good book, I think, yeah. And it's the marketing side that I just feel a real aversion to, even knowing that marketing is half of the equation to get on the New York Times list, and writing a good book is the other half.
Yeah, well, you don't have to think about marketing right now, right? Like, there's probably no particular benefit to thinking about it a couple of years in advance. So it does seem like quite an easy thing to like bury and just be like, yeah, whatever, I'll cross that bridge when I get there. I want to have a book that is the book quality equivalent of the New York Times. Yeah. And that's the first step, absent marketing. Yeah.
One thing that I'd written down that I'm very keen to get your thoughts on is how. So you mentioned that you did this kind of dating OkCupid thing, and then you sort of found someone after writing a 4-page message to them that you were in a relationship with for 10 years. When it comes to dating, I think kind of both Tame and I are having this quote problem is this thing of explore versus exploit, in that I feel like I have not dated very much. I have been on fewer than 10 first dates, I think, or sort of round about that ballpark. And so, I don't really know quote what I'm looking for beyond like just the very high level things of it would be nice to find someone who I find attractive and who I get on with, and like, that's basically sort of the most kind of narrow I've broken that down to. And then there's also a thing of, okay, what if I meet someone who I think, okay, yeah, I can see ourselves getting, I can see us getting married. I can imagine a future with this person. But it's like, I'm 26. I've only been on like 10 dates. Do I really know? Have I really got enough of a sample size to be able to make this decision? Especially if it's not a hell yes. Especially if it's like I'm not really sure how to feel, but like maybe things would work out for this person. I'm not like in love with them or anything like that, but like maybe it's just me. Maybe I just don't have the capacity to feel that. Do you get what I'm getting at? Explore versus exploit.
Yeah. I definitely do. I think one thing people forget with this sort of thing is often you have more data than you think, right? So yes, you personally have gone on 10 dates, and that's like very relevant, useful information, but you also know many other relationships, right? Presumably, friends in relationships, parents in relationships, this sort of thing. And that is not like zero sum data. If the 5 relationships, if you're considering a relationship or you're in a relationship and you're like, I'm, this level of connected, satisfied, whatever, and it seems like that is way below the average of my peers who are in long-term relationships, like that's probably a sign, that's probably indicative of that sort of thing. So that would be one thing. The other thing I would say is in terms of data, it doesn't have to be data in a purely romantic context, right? So if you go to like a general social setting and you're like, wow, I click with this person like X amount, and this is like really great, you want to kind of like find that cross-applicably in a romantic situation. One of the advice that I heard that I've always followed and I think is quite valuable, which is like marry your best friend. And I think the nice thing about that is you have had way more of a sample size of friends than you've had of romantic partners, typically. Most people have. And that's like a very useful frame to kind of put things in, because then you're thinking like, okay, is this, my best friend? Is this someone who I could, spend a lot of time with and kind of continue to enjoy that time at high levels of volume and this sort of thing. Yeah. And I think sometimes people have higher bars for friendship than relationships. So I think sometimes it does end up leading to somewhat different criteria.
Yeah, I think even if you're in like your 20s or whatever, you have probably met pretty much a pretty wide gamut of sort of people, and you probably have met enough people there already that you can have a pretty good sense for like, who do I get on with. And so I feel like you and I actually talked about this like a year ago or something, where you were saying the same thing of like, I need to do more exploration, I've only been on like a few dates or something. But yeah, I think like the meaningful data points are not just dates, it's also just like people and people you've met, and you probably have a pretty good understanding of the range of people that you could possibly meet.
Yeah. That being said, there is a more like softy psychology interpretation of this in terms of if you feel like you do not have enough data, even if you actually do, there can be a difference resulting there, right? So you might be able to say like, okay, well, I can extrapolate from friends and other relationships I've seen and yada, yada, and I think I have like a pretty good model. But there is something somewhat different about experiencing something. And if you kind of like feel like, at the end of the day, even if I met the perfect person, I'd feel like quite uncomfortable, like being in a long-term relationship at this point. I mean, that's a valuable thing to be honest with yourself about as well. And that could be the case, even if, yes, from a straight analytical perspective, you probably have like enough data points to make a call.
This is something I was talking about with my housemate last night, where it was on this topic of I think I am the sort of person, and feel free to tell me I'm bullshitting myself here. I think I am the sort of person where if I'm in a kind of long-term relationship with someone, I still think I would quite like the bulk, like 90% of our time to be spent doing our own thing, and 10% of our kind of waking hours to be spent kind of hanging out together, or maybe doing something together. And I wonder if, and my housemate's view was that if this 90-10 separation is what you're thinking, then chances are you're not ready for a long-term relationship, because at the point where you become ready for a long-term relationship, that number you start to actually want to spend more time with the person. And this is why people move in, and this is why people get married, because they want to spend more time together. But then I do have a few friends who are in kind of very long-term relationships, been married for 10 plus years, who are like, yeah, actually, we both spend 90% of our time doing different things, and then maybe on the weekends we'll do something together. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, similarly, I have friends and connections who I think are in like An interesting way to frame it is thinking about how much coordination you want to do with the partner, right? So different relationships, whether they be friendships or family members or that sort of thing, require different levels of like coordination. And maybe there's a friend who you like really like seeing once a month, but if they were your roommate, they would drive you absolutely nuts. And people have different like bars for each level of that coordination. It could be that you just don't want to have a super high level of coordination with someone. Like I definitely know people who are long-term happy relationships living separately, and that's how they like it. Like they don't want to be roommates with their romantic partner. And that's like fine. I think that, yeah, there probably are like some statistical trends of like, as you spend more time with someone, you end up coordinating with them kind of for better or worse, just because it's convenient in a bunch of ways and this sort of thing. But I don't think it's like an insane model to have. I do think some people are just more independent and want less coordination with a given person. And I would guess that this would reflect a little bit in other relationships that you've had. Like, you know, has every roommate you've ever had driven you nuts? That might be like a little bit indicative that having a romantic partner of a roommate will be like more challenging. It won't be all sunshine and rainbows. On the other hand, if you tend to love having roommates, maybe it is a matter of like finding the right partner who you would love to have as a roommate. And it's just that the partners you previously had might not fit that sort of like level of coordination. One thing I think is unfortunate that people do with relationships is they kind of like have all these knobs and they correlate them at all the same time. So like if you've spent X number of years with that person, you are now like obligated or expected or something to move in. And like that seems quite unfortunate because there is just a lot of human variance, and maybe some people don't want to move in ever. Maybe some people want to move in a lot quicker. And I wish there was like a bit more willingness to perhaps go against social norms when it comes to that sort of thing and do what seems to be working better for the relationship. So yeah, I know people who are separate. I would say it would depend on how you feel like your connections work with other interactions, and that would give some more predictive models.
Okay, so just on that, so on that note, so I've had roommates for the last for the last 9 years, basically since university, but since graduating 3 years ago, I've had like one roommate for 18 months and another roommate for the last like 8 months, and it's been really good. Like I love having a roommate, like slash flatmate, but I think part of the reason why I love it is because we are living together, but there is almost, on my end anyway, there's almost zero requirement to hang out with them. In that, like, you know, if I want to stay up till midnight playing World of Warcraft or doing some YouTube stuff, then that's totally cool. It's not like there is an obligation of, all right, you know, it's 8 p.m. and now we need to spend some time together. My housemate would say that that's a sign of immaturity on my part. Any thoughts?
In my mind, that doesn't specify not being able to live with a romantic partner. You just need to be clear in terms of what the expectations are. Like, I've lived long-term with multiple romantic partners. I'm living long-term with a romantic partner right now. And it's not like we're under obligation to go to bed at the same time or that sort of thing. I would actually say those sort of things, that sounds a bit more like you've freshly moved in with someone than you've actually been living with someone for like 12 months or that sort of thing. Like, people do independent stuff and that sort of thing. I think the real trick is just, making sure both people are on the same page, because you don't want someone who's like, oh yeah, I expect that we're going to spend after work time together every day, and someone else to be like, oh, I expect we're going to spend after work time together at the same frequency of dating, but then sleep in the same bed. Then you run into troubles if like the expectations are really different. But again, the benefits of pulling out your values, kind of knowing what you're looking for, and actually being able to be clear about it. If you have no idea, if you're like, okay, I want to move in with someone and I have no idea how it's going to go, I mean, then your expectations and reality are almost definitely going to be different.
Yeah. Okay, that's very cool. A fun thing that I'd love to get your opinion on, just on this topic, is, and again, this is this is turning into a personal therapy session, but oh well. Like, how much do you weight the attractiveness of your partner, taking into account the fact that of hedonic adaptation, etc., like all of the nuances associated with having a preference for looks? How do you think about it, or how did you think about it, say, 10 years ago when you were doing this online dating type stuff?
Yeah, it's always not been that important to me. So that's like a nice answer. Now, I would say revealed preference-wise, a lot of my partners have been very attractive. Some have not, but a lot have. So I don't know. Maybe there's like some factor there that I'm not being honest enough with myself on. But I genuinely do think it's not the biggest factor. I think an interesting model to have is there are factors that fade and factors that don't, right? So if you're looking at something like looks, no matter how attractive someone is, that becomes a less significant part of the relationship once you're 10 years in, like, period. That's just everyone kind of agrees, knows that tends to be how it goes. I've always been very, very long-termist in my approach to everything, career, life, friends, that sort of thing. So I think when I think of something as more of like, oh yeah, this would be important in the short term, that's never been as big a factor for me. So when I'm thinking about characteristics that I'm looking for, it is, in the similar vein of what I was talking about, value alignment, connection, compatibility on kind of like work topics and talking about, things we care about, enjoying spending time with a person, these sort of characteristics. Looks has not played that big a factor in. But my friends would be like, oh, well, yeah, if looks have not played a big factor, why are the people you're dating, so attractive? But I think that's been somewhat like random chance and somewhat just like correlations. So like, maybe someone who's very conscientious puts some more time into their physical appearance than like an average person or something like this. But yeah, it's not in the top 10 of characteristics that I look for.
Wait, so what are you actually saying there? Are you saying that you personally just have a very low a low threshold for who you would be physically attracted to, or are you saying that you have a pretty standard threshold for who you'd be physically attracted to, but you just choose to not care so much about being physically attracted to someone who you're in a relationship with?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think A, it started off less important than most people for me, and then B, I thought like, that's not really a trait that I like about myself or value myself. So I kind of explicitly said like I don't want to care about this, and did start to care about it less. So I think okay. Both have happened. Like I probably started off in an easier state than most, and then pushed it to be even less important as a characteristic.
How do you push it? Is it just like introspection and just kind of try to internalize that I shouldn't care about this thing?
Yeah, so, I mean, have you ever heard about different techniques that people use for quitting smoking, where you like kind of like notice that, so that there's these techniques where you're kind of like doing value modification on yourself when it comes to smoking, and you're trying to like notice the bad parts of smoking. So when you're addicted to smoking, you think about all the kind of good aspects, but if you really focus on like, oh, this tastes awful or something, and like every time you do it, eventually it starts to like taste quite bad, and that becomes like the salient part of the experience. So I think some sort of like associative thinking and that sort of thing. So if I'm like, the sort of person I want to be, is not someone who's highly concerned with looks. I don't really like that. That's a character trait I'm not a fan of, and I think that's a silly character trait to care about anyways, because it doesn't matter in the long term. There's hedonic adaptation type of thing. These sort of aspects. I think like telling yourself that makes a difference. I think exposure makes a difference. So I think sometimes you can think like, oh, I couldn't ever date someone with X, and then you date someone and you're like, actually, that was kind of fine. Like it didn't really matter in practice. So some of that sort of aspect, and also I think really explicitly about the trade-offs. So say I don't care about looks at all. My dating pool is bigger. The characteristics that I can maximize on other dimensions like value compatibility is much higher. And to me, that's much more important. So in some ways, I don't even view it as like letting go of looks and not caring about it at all. I see it as like, oh, I'm totally not willing to trade off looks for kind of any of these other characteristics that I put in like higher regard.
But I think most people will kind of view looks as like a satisficing thing of their partner needs to be above some threshold of attractiveness. Are you basically saying that you have like reduced that threshold, through like deliberate practice or something? Or do you not see it as a satisfying thing? Do you see it as more of like a maximizing thing? Like if they're if you think they are very unattractive, then them being like, them having very aligned values can actually make up for the unattractiveness.
Yeah, so again, a bit of both. Like, if I think someone's personality is awesome, they do just like look more attractive to me.
Yeah.
And I think that does happen to everybody. Yeah. But I also think that my like natural bar is like low enough that it's never been a problem. So low enough that there has never been someone who I like, this person would match my dating criteria, but they are missing this looks component. Nothing has happened there. So maybe there is like some lower threshold, and I just like haven't bumped into a person that fits this. But it has not. I've never had to compromise on other things that I care about more, which is really the important question. Like, again, if I could snap my fingers and the person's super attractive, like sure, that's great. But I'm not willing to trade off, say like intellectual compatibility or something like this.
Yeah. So
another thing.
Sorry. Yeah. Go.
So I was just going to say, another nice thing about knowing your values and having unique values for anything is it makes it a lot easier to find what you're looking for. So if I'm looking for a house, on the UK market, and I care not at all about natural light. That's great. I can probably find a house that has really crappy natural light, but is very good on all the metrics that I do care about. If I'm looking for literally the same house as everybody else, so like, oh yeah, I'd like big natural light and new floors and this sort of thing, then it's a very difficult world to be in. And the same is true for the dating market. If you're a little bit weird, it's easier to find someone who's compatible because not everyone is looking for someone who's super into effective altruism like I am. Yeah. But for me, that's a really important trait. So like, great. And that works better. So I actually think it's actually beneficial if you can find areas that you uniquely do care about or uniquely don't care about relative to just like the standard person, because then you can find people.
Yeah, market inefficiencies.
Yeah, it's like on the note of like changing our values / desires. There was a point last year, I think it was last year, 2 years ago, I mentioned on the podcast where I had this exact thought process. I was like, okay, in this realm of dating, I currently care way too much about looks, and that caringness about looks is not warranted. Like, if I could take a pill and not care about looks, I would absolutely do that. And I was like, okay, what can I actually do in my life to make this not the case? And I realized that prior to this decision, I'd been following a load of like swimsuit models on Instagram. I was like, all right, cool, I'm followed on all of these different accounts. Great, okay, that's one aspect of my life in which now that's like I am not constantly reminded that, oh my god, there are these beautiful women out there. Any other suggestions on that front? Because like, if I could take a magic pill, like genuinely I would. I think I care way too much about looks, and this is like bad. But it's like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So desire modification. So a few different things. One thing is you can find like replacements that get at that similar drive. So an interesting question is like, why do you care about looks? Is it because you really care about visual beauty and you should, surround your house with artwork? Or is it because it's kind of like a high status thing to like date someone who's really attractive and that makes you feel kind of good in that way?
I think for me, it's more like the status thing. It's more like I want my friends to think like, oh,
Yeah, and that often is a thing.
So bad.
Wow.
Yeah.
But then the question is like, okay, well, now that I know that like this is connected to, I want my friends to think well of me, to think that I'm cool and can get a desirable partner. What if I talk to my friends about what I actually desire in a person? That changes things, right? So all my friends know that I'm not looking for a super attractive person. They know I'm looking for someone who's super hardcore in altruism and someone who's super intelligent and that sort of thing. So from a kind of like, Joey is good at maximizing his goals in finding romantic partners. They know that my goals are aberrant and different. Just like they would look at my house with no natural light and they wouldn't be like, oh, you got screwed. They'd be like, oh, yeah, you don't care about natural light. You found a good house, except, of course, I wouldn't rent it because natural light. So I think that sort of thing can be helped. If you can like decouple these kind of like mixed up drives and think that like, oh, yeah, that. The other thing that I would add here is people tend to think that people tend to way overweight this sort of thing in terms of how much other people care. So that's a good thing to realize too. Like we are each the center of our own universes, right? So we think that like each of our actions are like really, really impactful and like our friends totally remember this and think about this. And just like everyone else has like other things going on in their life, right? So I think, letting go of that a little bit. Your friends probably already think you're cool. They probably don't need like, you to have a supermodel to like continue to think you're cool. You've probably already won that battle to a large extent. So
I don't know.
That's maybe an aspect.
I think you're kind of on the fence right now. You need to score a few more points. Right on the edge.
Yeah, double my subscriber count, and then I'll be fine.
Kudos for coming out and like admitting to that on the podcast. I think was that easy. I mean, I think you seem pretty happy with just kind of being pretty open about these things.
Yeah, mate. Like in a way, I mean, there's an element of like. Honestly, I think so many other people think like this, and I do get a bit of a kick in sort of saying the thing out loud that I feel other people are thinking that they're not saying, and it adds to my thing of one of the things that I know that I value is like transparency and honesty and stuff in most things that I do, and so it like ties into that.
Another thing on the desire modification in terms of like getting experience, I wouldn't be surprised. So the kind of we talked about the spreadsheet like not working for someone's dating, and it's because they were like incorrect about one of their parameters. I think people are incorrect about their parameters all the time. So if there's a parameter that you'd kind of want to be incorrect on, check it. Like if your bar is A, can you go on a date with someone who's like a little bit below A and they're really compatible in every other way? Probably you'll find, oh, actually the bar wasn't strictly this. I'm actually like pretty happy with how this is going. So that's another thing that you can do. You can kind of like on a macro side say like, this is a value I don't really want. I'm going to try compromising on this and try experimenting with people who are a bit below this value. And this is a value I really do want. So I'm going to hold it quite fixed. So maybe for me, it's like I need to be in a relationship with someone ethical. I'm not really going to change that. That's going to be a kind of high value. I don't want to experiment with dating someone less ethical because I don't want to date someone less ethical. That's not the plan. But looks, maybe I'm okay dating someone or trying to date someone less attractive, and maybe it doesn't work out. Maybe it turns out that bar is like quite fixed around that level. But often, I think people are. So if we're putting in a spreadsheet, I think people have elimination criteria. Like if someone falls below a 5 on each of these traits, they're gone. Where I actually think social relationships are more like multiplicative. So if someone scores quite low on A, but they're really good on all these other things, the relationship can still work quite well. So if that is a model, sometimes experimentation can kind of like reveal that like, yeah, if they're good enough on these other characteristics, then the bar for this one isn't quite as steep.
Okay, I've got a question.
Wait, sorry, just to stick on that same note before we move on. I think there's also a danger of you bullshitting yourself. I think that what might be also partly going on is that it makes decision making a lot easier if you have this very easy disqualification criteria where if they're not basically a supermodel, then, well, I'm not attracted to them, therefore I'm not going to date this person. It makes it very easy to not put in, it takes sort of effort and work to meet people and build relationships and stuff. If you tell yourself, well, they're not a supermodel, therefore I won't go on a date with them. It makes your life easier. It's easier to kind of sit in your room, play World of Warcraft, make YouTube videos, and say, "Oh man, I've got it so hard. I just need someone really attractive, man." That's what's holding me back. It's almost. I mean, it's not dignified, but it's it's almost dignified to be able to say that. That's the limiting factor is that I just I have such a high bar.
There's a lot of people who are fearful of going on dates who say they're picky. I think that is like outside view. That's a thing that happens that a lot of people say. So, yeah.
Okay, so the things that I've tried to do to combat this is I sort of set a bar for myself where it's like if for example I'm matched with someone on Hinge, then I will. This was all like pre-lockdown, but the thing I was saying in my head, which again feels stupid to admit out loud, but it's like as long as I think, oh, she's kind of cute, then I will be more than happy to go on at least one date with her. And then after I did this a couple of times, it was that issue of like, okay, I'm not really sure how you're supposed to feel at the end of a first date, and it's like, okay, so how do you decide whether this warrants like a second date? It's like, well, I'm not really sure how you're supposed to feel and so after speaking to a few friends about this, they were like, well, everyone's always a little bit kind of nervous on the first day, and like second date maybe like setting a 3-date rule whereby if you're talking to someone and things were all right, like all right is the bar to decide whether to go on a second or a third date with them, and then you figure it out. But then like the issue that I'm actually sort of that I was running into is like at each of these intervals, how like what are you supposed to be feeling as like the bar for continuing? Because there are friends of mine who are in relationships where it was like, oh, from date one, I just knew. And I was like, okay, great. Well, that's great for you. But outside of one time when I was 18, I've never had that feeling of, oh my God, I just knew. And it's like, then at that point it becomes do I like, what's the feeling here? And which for me is always just a little bit like, I don't really know, versus what's the sort of the logical thought process here, i.e., we match on values and we enjoy spending time with one another, and therefore this should continue into like a exclusive relationship or something like that. What, Joey? Like, I'm curious. Like, what's your heuristic for? Do I like this enough to warrant to continue this relationship?
I might sound like a broken record, but I do think a lot of it comes down to like meta self-awareness. So, for instance, I think a lot of people get infatuated very quickly. So they'll like go on a date, they'll be like, wow, this person's like 15 out of 10. Yep. I am 110% sold. And for that sort of person, I mean, if they have felt that rush with like half of first dates they go on, probably the other half, you don't go on a second date because that feeling is happening pretty often. You're hitting that 15. For me, I don't really get infatuation. I kind of have like a negative prior about someone, and then I get like a slow, like positive updates. So I tend to like people more I tend to like people more the more I get to know them, which is great because it doesn't mean I get to that 15 and make all sorts of crazy decisions. I'm kind of like, okay, I like this person a little bit more, I like this person a little bit more, and then that kind of like, escalates over time. So I think that's the kind of question you have to ask yourself. And I might exclude the first data point because the first relationship reverend is very weird and quite strange. But if you're generally not getting a rush, period, you just might not be that sort of person. You just might not be the sort of person who gets that huge escalation. So it's more like, is this in the top 10% of dates I've been on? Maybe it's worth a second date then. Is that second date in the top 25% of second dates I've been on? Maybe it's worth a third date or something like that. I would say for me, the first 3 dates are very much just getting a sense of the person and getting to know them. And I really like coffee dates and talking to people and kind of like heavy amounts of social interaction because, of course, I like talking in general. And then it tends to move more towards like, okay, what do you think? Like after the 3 dates, it's like, what's the long-term trajectory of this? We should talk about what we're interested in this sort of aspect. But yeah, I wouldn't let it stop you. I think people have perhaps this like overly Hollywood romanticized notion that like, you're gonna like look at someone and be like, oh my God. And of course, if you're looking at someone, unless like holding like a protest sign or something like that, all you know is their aesthetics, which is already like not a very good long-term predictor. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's what I do. Like, am I more excited with this date than I have been with many of my other dates? Or am I not? Not like a kind of a cross comparable with other humans reference class of like, some people are just more excitable.
Interesting. Yeah, because like a lot of friends have said to me that, well, if you're in this position kind of 3 dates later where you're still not sure, then the fact that you're not sure is your answer. And, you don't want to sort of necessarily get into a relationship or, whatever with someone that you're not sure about. Therefore, you should be sure after X number of hangouts with this person as to whether you want to pursue this. And I've never...
I don't know. Some people are never sure. Some people are never sure. Like, there's always some... I think when I talk to rationalists about this in particular, they're like aware of statistics, right? So, 50% of marriages end in divorce and, most relationships aren't super long-term and that sort of thing. So I think sometimes that's in the back of the head, even if you're like, yeah, this feels like it's going very well, but like, I'm aware that, this sort of thing, it feels like it's going to last forever. Most of the time it's not. So like you could distrust that feeling. So yeah, I don't think you need to be sure to go on a date with another person. I think it's about how it has felt relative to other similar situations, and then try to benchmark off of that.
Awesome, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for the for the wisdom of this topic. This is actually very, very helpful stuff.
Yeah, I think one weird thing about dating is a bit like happiness. It is one of those things where if you like try to grasp at it, it can move further away. A model I heard on this is you just want to meet a lot of people generally, not just in romantic context, but period. And then like very much be a version of your best self. And that's kind of like the recipe to find someone. And I think that's like pretty good. I do think you can be more analytic about it. And, online dating has this power of just being able to look through like thousands and thousands of people really quickly, which is cool. But I do think if there was like two soft heuristics, it would be like, make yourself the person that you would want the person to date, kind of thing, and just interact with and meet just a ton of people, especially a ton of people who are kind of in the reference class of people you'd consider dating. So, if it was me meeting a lot of people who care about ethics, that's going to be a good way to meet someone who's eventually going to be a really good long-term partner.
Nice. Very good advice. One other thing that I'd written down that I'm curious if I'm sure you've thought about this is, have you found any sort of like quick and easy happiness hacks for your life, like things that surprised you in terms of, oh, this thing surprisingly makes me more happy and it's actually not that effortful and more people should do this thing?
Yeah, I have a bunch. The first one is tracking your happiness is super important because if you don't track it, then of course you cannot do an experiment and see if it in fact makes you happier. I think people think they kind of can, but they totally can't. It's very hard to know how happy you are day to day. You tend to think whatever you're feeling at that minute is how you felt for a really long time. And then you look at that and you're like, wait a second, I'm feeling bad right now, but I felt great all this week. So it's like the first step. Like I track my happiness every day. Yeah. So my daily tracking routine looks something like I have a happiness score, I have a productivity score, and then I have some hypotheses that I'm testing. So maybe I'm testing, waking up earlier in the morning or something like this, and I want to see what does it do. So I'll do that, and I actually tend to do like a 1 week experiment, and then if it works, I'll do it later in a 1 month experiment and see if it works on a longer time span. And if kind of the results are looking good,